Hello, my name is James Hayward and I'm from Homes England's Local Government Capacity Centre. I'm delighted to welcome you to our Winter Learning programme. This offers a series of knowledge sharing sessions on topics you've told us are of interest to you. Today's event is called Myth-Busting Design Codes. Next slide, please. Before we start, I'll introduce you to the Local Government Capacity Centre and share a word from our CEO. This winter learning programme is brought to you by Homes England's Local Government Capacity Centre, which launched in the summer of last year. This slide summarises who we are and what we do. We've launched the centre following extensive research and consultation with you across local government and with a whole range of other partners to determine where authorities most need support and how this can best be delivered. I'm delighted to open this session for Homes England's Local Government Capacity Centre by showing you this welcome message from our Chief Executive, Peter Denton. As you can see, Peter is committed to ensuring Homes England supports your work and shares expertise, experience and skills to help get homes built. Next slide, please, for the agenda. On this screen, you'll see a breakdown of the session today. So we'll start with design quality and coding, some practicalities from a Homes England perspective, delivered by Dan Roberts and Lee Johnson of the Master Development and Design team at Homes England. Following that, we'll discuss the National Model Design Code testing from Scott Adams, the urban design lead in the design quality team at DLUC. After that, Nuneaton and Bedworth Council's Ashley Baldwin will give us some lessons learned on the pilot round 1. And then we'll follow up with a panel Q&A with Lee Johnson, Scott Adams and Ashley Baldwin. Without further ado, I'll hand over to Dan Roberts.
Thank you, James. The Master Development and Design team is small within technical services here at Homes England, providing help and guidance across the agency. Prior to the National Model Design Code, Homes England had adopted a design quality assessment process, which has been adapted to respond to the requirements of the Building Better, Building Beautiful Commission report and subsequent government guidance as well. Next slide, please. There's a lot of advice and guidance available alongside the National Model Design Code. Since April 2019, Homes England has used Building for Life as its adopted design quality assessment tool. This forms the basis of our assessment, but we've encouraged the use of other tools and methods such as design review and design coding alongside the use of Building for Life. Building for Life is an industry accepted assessment tool and widely used by house builders and developers across the country. Next slide, please. The latest iteration of Building for Life, Building for a Healthy Life, was launched in July 2020 and Homes England adopted BHL as its design quality assessment tool in August 2020. As a public sector user of Building for Life 12 beforehand, the agency was asked to advise on the practicability of the emerging redrafted document, and in particular regarding its potential effects on deliverability and likely acceptability amongst development partners. Next slide, please. So why do we use Building for a Healthy Life? Well, as well as being accepted by government and actually referred to by government in policy, it's also a very practical way for the agency to influence design quality across its various services. It supports the agency's emerging policies and procedures with regard to sustainability and design, our end-to-end master planning process, and our forthcoming place pledge, which is intended to provide a consistency and quality across the agency's work. It's also straightforward to use, prompting the right questions at the right time in the design process. Next slide, please. There are 12 considerations which are illustrated, and crucially, They are place-based. It provides a useful prompt for discussion throughout the design process. BHL is more than an assessment tool. We know how it can work and have demonstrated raising quality in our land disposals process. The next step is to use it as a golden thread that runs through our end-to-end process and across the agency's business. By considering what the site can deliver in terms of the 12 considerations through the process, we are able to build a total number of greens through our acquisition and de-risking procedures, resulting in sites going to market that are comfortably able to secure an appropriate threshold of greens in each case with each site. I'll now hand over to Lee Johnson, Head of Master Development and Design at Homes England, who's going to talk about using Building for a Healthy Life to inform the coding process.
That's great. So thank you for the introduction. I would say in the last year, since we've been having discussions with colleagues at DULUC and obviously the emerging National Model Design Code, we've taken some steps towards embedding that approach in how we work. And like I said earlier, some of our sites are halfway through their life cycle. So we can't just retrofit a design code. So what we're trying to do is work with the principles that are set out in the National Model Design Code, but model it around Building for a Healthy Life so that it informs the coding that we expect. So moving forward, all of Homes England sites will need to be Building for a Healthy Life compliant. And therefore, any codes that we commission or that we embed on any of our sites or parcels have to be Building for a Healthy Life compliant as well. So that's the work that informs the principles of that coding for that site. So it can be used to help structure and identify the content of the code, which may vary depending on the local context and priorities. And the appropriate use and form of code can be chosen to address the scale of development or particular deficits in the area, e.g. reference to local distinctiveness and character. Next slide, please. So what this visual sets out here is this gives us a process that we've had agreed and we've put in place, and it's working. This is this sort of upstream approach on some of our live sites. So the process that we have is that we have a tender form 5, which is how we take sites to the market, which have an outline consent. Sometimes those sites prior to the National Model Design Code being launched, some of those sites might have had a design code, and that would have been at the behest of the local planning authority rather than either us as a landowner or the landowner that we bought the site from. So we would have applied Building for a Healthy Life as an assessment to understand, how this site could be delivered. But what we're now looking to do is we undertake pre-assessment work. So we review that site, we look at the component parts of what parts of Building for a Healthy Life it can deliver. So we call that a pre-assessment, and we form a very simple parcel code. So this is based on, bear in mind, this could be based on a scheme, I don't know, maybe 500 homes, and this could be a sub parcel that's being taken to the market, which doesn't have a design code. But what we're trying to do is embed principles of qualitative element. It came to light, and I'm going to touch on it on the next slide, but it came to light on a very large site that we acquired that had an outline consent, had a really good set of parameter plans and a master plan. But when you then break that site of 1,000 homes down into maybe 5 parcels, we weren't confident that there was any one thing that was going to make that site hang together. And so that's why Homes England are using Building for a Healthy Life and the principles of design coding to create these small sub parcel codes on existing sites or with extant planning consents to create that baseline and establish the quality. It then gives us a baseline that we can not only score against, we can deliver the level of expectation we want on design quality, identify the things that are key and are non-negotiable in terms of design quality, and also score against. And then at the back end of it, we can then look at it and we can score not only on the bidders but how they deliver, to see how that code was implemented, how that design principle was implemented, and then everything from did it improve the not only did it improve the design quality, but did it improve and speed up the planning process? Did it build confidence and reassurance within the local authority if they see a site coming from Homes England that has a pre-assessment on it, that it should speed up the planning process and build confidence and credibility on that scheme? So this is how we're looking at. We're embedding it in the requirement into our disposals process. the proposal is that we seek consistent, independent and impartial advice. So when we do the pre-assessment, that will be with a design network or an independent body, so that they are challenging us, identifying what's right for that site. What is the pre-assessment? What can that site deliver? And how do we capture that in a simple code form? The parcel code is then produced either in-house by my team or will form part of the master planner consultants commission. An external advisor, i.e. the design network, can then support the assessment of bids in reference to the pre-assessment baseline. And this process will capture data at key points, which will then inform quality audit. So we're challenged and questioned quite a lot by DLUC and other parties to say, what are we doing to improve the quality element of delivery? And so if we have this baseline information using codes in terms of, what is acceptable, what works, what's key for that site, and we have it as a baseline and we've challenged it and we've checked it, we can then report against it as the site evolves. Next slide, please. So this site was the one that we first, it's a site, Lightthorn Heath, which was part of a wider scheme. And as I said, it had a very, we acquired the site, it had an outline consent, the Section 106 was in place, it had a really pretty good set of parameter plans and a quite a solid master plan, but we weren't aware, because we bought it with the consent in place, so we weren't aware as if the site had been tested, as in doing capacity testing to inform that master plan. And so there were elements on this site that, so the first parcel, which is off the main spine road, which was going to come to the market, and there was pressure to get this site out quickly so that we could get houses built. But it was, how do we take these 7 parcels, I think it was effectively 7 parcels of circa 200 homes each, if they are sold to 7 independent house builders or SMEs, what's going to be the glue that's going to make them hang together? Because the master plan, in theory, it was referred to in the outline consent, but it was illustrative. The parameter plans were informative. So there wasn't a code of such that was in place. So this was the first time that we as a team looked at the principles of the design National Model Design Code and looked at what can we do. We call it a parcel code, for want of a better word. It's the first parcel that's coming to the market, and it's looking at that site in the context of the wider project and thinking about what are the things that we will insist on. And now this is where we have the benefit of the control contractually. So this is not only something that we would seek to provide support. We would engage with the local authority and say, look, you've got your outline consent, there's the master plan in place. We believe we can get another layer of security and certainty on the design quality if we create this master plan, this parcel code. So hopefully that will build reassurance with the local authority in terms of the credibility and the quality coming forward. But from us, this is something that would then be included in our lease, because all our sites are sold on the open market, but they're sold with the benefit of a building lease, which means we still control the land, and therefore there is a contractual requirement for the end user that has bought this site to comply with this parcel code. So this phase, this particular land release, we undertake a pre-assessment of the site. We understand, what are the basic principles of building for a healthy life that works, and how can we score really highly on it. We take that information and we turn that then into a very simple parcel code, talking about principles of frontage, spine road, which are the key secondary streets, where are the main points of access. So it's a layer of testing so that we take the site to the market and we are clear in our understanding of what that site can deliver. And therefore, when schemes come in, if they deviate from this parcel code, then they'll be scored accordingly. So this gives us the baseline to expect more. So it's produced in-house, and like I said earlier, or part of the Consultants Commission, and we're looking to continue to develop this year. And this is where we'll work closer with the information in the National Model Design Code to see what are the elements that we can use on these interim sites that already have an outline consent in place. And we're continuing to develop it further, i.e. what are the must, shoulds and coulds. And so what's important to Homes England to make sure that when these sub-parcels all come together, the sum of the parts is a legible and a readable and an acceptable site in terms of its design quality and placemaking. Next slide, please. So the next slide is another example. This is a later version, again, a similar site. This site, we acquired it because it was stalled. You can see the 2 pretty hefty spine road with roundabouts. They're already constructed, so they are a constraint, I suppose, from a design perspective, but they're an opportunity for that site to be delivered quickly. And it was a case of, rather than just taking the site to the market with a red line, because again, the site didn't have a design code, but it did have an extant outline consent. The team, my team in particular, looked at this, worked with the local delivery team who were securing, who were looking to take the site to the market, to say, right, what's the expectation here? What do we want of our partners? How do we influence and invest a level of quality placemaking in this site before we take it to the market? So again, this design fix, this parcel code, and it's not exhaustive, but we were key on this one to identify a range of parking typologies, the key points of access, both vehicular and pedestrian, areas of POS, areas of active frontage, and whether the perimeter blocks were in the right location, to give a wholesale understanding of the development areas, and also the context interaction with future phases. But more importantly, it started to establish things like, we're key to establish what street hierarchy is and whether there are street trees, because obviously we understand if we start to influence and dictate that we require things like this, that will have a commercial impact on that sale of that land. But again, we'll be informed because we'll know that street trees on a certain road hierarchy level will have an impact on the developable land. And as long as we as the landowner are aware of that, we know that that code is informing that, that will be reflected in the bids. But again, it's about control and being informed when we take these sites to the market. Next slide, please. And then this is my final slide. This is a really typical example of where we are as Homes England. Now, as I've said before, moving forward on all new commissions and new sites that we're acquiring as an agency, when we are preparing the outline consent, we will naturally, as a matter of course, adopt a design code for that site as a landowner and work with the local authority to deliver that, to ensure that there is best quality and placemaking at the heart of it. This is a large site that is effectively a legacy site in the northeast, I believe. The site was, I think at least 3 parcels have already been, they're already built out, and the primary spine road for this site is already in place. It's effectively it's an old hospital site, and it's in a parkland setting. So already this site is giving you the answers. It's giving you some constraints in a positive way of how to deal with. And what we wanted to do was, so let's look at what we can do on coding on this site. We've got 2 final parcels to sell. We want to, how do we raise the game and not allow precedent? Because earlier phases of this site, they're okay in terms of development, but they're not allowing the project to really sing and create identity. There are 2 traditional PLC house builders already building on this site, and it could fall into the trap of sort of any home, any type, anywhere. And so the challenge for my team and the disposal team is, how do we work with this existing outline consent so that we ensure speed of delivery and continued build? But how do we ask that little bit more and understand what we do with this site? So we took the design code principles, we took Building for a Healthy Life, we worked with the design network in that area, which I think, I can't recall the name of the body, that someone might put it in the chat, Dan Roberts might be able to, but we worked and we did a pre-assessment of this site. We looked at how the site delivers at the moment, looking at the context, what are the constraints and opportunities, and then what elements of coding, working with the principles of Building for a Healthy Life, because it's our KPI, how can we merge those 2 and create a very simple parcel code for this site to take to the market, so that both parties, both us as the landowner and the seller of the land, engage with potential bidders so that everybody knows what is expected of us. It's our opportunity to raise the game. And what was really interesting with the outcome of this one is that we've got 2 very different areas on the site. We've got one very formal, quite structured approach on the right hand side, which is in the area where the original historic buildings were. So the hospital buildings were. So we used that as a form and type of layout for the coding which was expected. And then on the left hand side of the site was a much more informal, softer edge, more rural approach. And in actual fact, the bids that came in, they were far more competitive, and there was actually a better quality of housing that came forward. The numbers were up, the land value was improved slightly. And again, we now have this level of control that will not only support the planning application at reserve matters stage, but it will also allow us as an agency to hold the developers to account, to say that this is a design code. Not only is it used for planning, but it's also a contractual obligation for us. You submitted your bid based on you could deliver this coding approach off this parcel code, and we will expect them to deliver and improve their quality of placemaking in the homes that they built. So our mantra at the moment, using all the tools that we have at our disposal, in particular the emerging coding work, is that our job is to create better places everywhere with the use of whatever tools we have in our kit of parts and our tool chest. And on that note, I will pass over to Scott. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Lee. Yes, first slide here. Yes, I'm Scott Adams. I'm Urban Design Lead within the Design Quality Team at the Department for Leveling Up, Housing and Communities, or DLUC, and I'm here to speak about the National Model Design Code Testing Program. Next slide, please. This is the first poll, and we're just asking if any local authorities here or housing associations are developing design codes or planning to do so. And if you can just click in the appropriate selection once the poll comes up. So not sure. So far, most of you are not sure if you're planning to do design codes or not. Also, quite a few of you are, but using a combination of in-house skills and outside expertise, a good amount using in-house, and less so just using outside expertise. So that's really good to get some insights. Great. So next slide, please. As you hopefully know, the National Model Design Code sets out the process to follow according to 3 stages to develop a design code. It's using analysis, vision, and code stages. Throughout the process, there should be meaningful consultation to deliver the design codes, and it was the draft National Model Design Code that we used as the basis for the testing program. So hopefully, if you haven't seen the National Model Design Code, do check it out. It's easily downloadable. It's accessible, and it's a good process to follow. Next slide, please. And so the testing program was designed to test the aspects of the process and content of the then draft National Model Design Code, and it was aiming to do so in a range of contexts. Early in 2021, we received over 70 expressions of interest to test the application locally. And whilst initially we were intending to have 10 pilots, the then Secretary of State selected 14 local authority teams. And this was due not only to the quality of the proposals, but also the great range of contexts being tested. And so we had testing teams across the 9 English regions. And overall, there was a great range of scale from testing authority-wide scales down to site-specific sites. Next slide, please. And we wanted to make sure it was quite comprehensive, so the different contexts covered rural, suburban, town, and city contexts. And we loosely defined 4 different categories for the testing, one being rural or area-wide testing, another being large sites and extensions. Others were looking at town centers and neighborhoods, and finally, groups were also looking at city center regeneration testing programs. And so development types range from new settlements and urban extensions. There were large allocated sites, which Ashley will be talking about after this presentation, area-wide regeneration, area intensification, and infill. And so not only the different contexts were important, but also the different stages of the National Model Design Code were important to test. So, for example, we had some early testing looking at a new settlement where there was lots of demand for housing, but let's say probably some resistance to new development. So they were really testing baseline information and how do you actually get meaningful engagement early in the process with communities, all the way towards the end or latter parts of the design coding process. There was one team that was doing an area-wide design guide. They had an existing policy or guidance in place, and they wanted to see what worked with it, what could be enhanced, and how to do so using the National Model Design Code. And so at the end of the program, which the testing teams formally concluded at the end of September, there was a range of different outputs from coding plans and bespoke area types to master plans and draft design codes. And many of the teams also, or a handful of the teams developed a range of how-to guides and templates. And these were to be developed to demonstrate how a local authority could roll out design coding in the future across their local authority. Next slide, please. And so we want to capture a range of findings, and we had interim and final reports. And so we internally looked at a few different categories to understand what we can learn from this process. The first being using the National Model Design Code in practice. Teams basically stated that the defined structure with clear themes was very helpful. It was easily understandable, and there was a flexible approach that could apply to local circumstances. They also stated that it was useful to structure their testing approach or the draft design code according to the National Design Guide's 10 characteristics of well-designed places. That's the wheel to the right. Many use the categories or the appropriate categories if their parameters were more narrow in scope. And oftentimes they also use the color coding to structure their design codes or their testing process. Teams also stated that the engagement section provides a useful overview of methods and techniques, and also that the illustrations and diagrams were quite helpful in communicating the principles that were in the text. A few of the teams stated that further guidance on using area types would be quite helpful, as well as further definitions of the terminology used. And that was mostly so in the context of community engagement, where some of the terms might have seemed too technical, for example. Other teams also stated that example templates and design codes would be quite welcomed, and obviously that will be part of the second phase of the program. Next slide, please. According to early findings with respect to testing processes, skills, and resources, while some of the teams had undertaken the testing fully in-house, most of the teams brought in at least some consultant skills, and this was due to identify gaps in skills. So, for example, one team didn't have the urban design and the graphic illustration skills in-house, so they brought on a person to undertake that. Or sometimes they lacked the resources, so there was a team that had the skills, but they just didn't have the time or capacity, so they brought in a team to do the testing for them. And some had obviously gaps in skills and resources. However, teams that stated they had in-house design skills said that it assisted them with engaging and guiding consultants. And this ranged from briefing consultants to following the process and ensuring that they guided the consultants sufficiently to get the result that they wanted at the end of the process. At the start of the testing program, a lot of the teams said that there was more time than they expected to start the process. This included bringing the consultants on board through the tendering process, to fully define the testing area and the scope, which essentially covered the range of parameters that they'd be considering, to develop methodologies. There was a few teams that wanted to expand the role of community engagement in the process. And some teams had issues with obtaining internal sign-offs, which delayed their start. Teams also found that initial programs often required more time and resource than expected for aspects of the testing process. This included the coding plan process. So a couple of the teams did look at area types and looked at how they could develop a coding plan for an area of their local authority. Obviously, this was a new area for them to undertake, and it took longer than they thought. This was partly because they had to determine how granular they would get into detail. They started a mapping exercise where they got really close into the detail, and it took a lot of time. They found another way to go, which was more automated and using GIS software, but then that was more high level, and they had to determine which might be more useful for them in the future. Also, other teams found that internal engagement and coordination took much more time, and especially in the city center regeneration areas where there was many more departments needing engagement, it took time to share what the project objectives were and how the different departments could fit in. However, the teams also equally said that the internal communication was quite useful, as were regular updates. Next slide, please. And finally, the early findings on engagement in using codes. Every team had a level of community and or stakeholder engagement as part of their testing. I think it was 2 of the teams didn't have an open community engagement process. And that was because they were looking at testing a certain aspect, and they were intending this to continue after the testing program. In the one case where they would continue their work, and the other was just doing testing, really looking at area types and how applicable it would be in their situation. So it was more just testing the use of area codes in coding plans versus engaging more widely. Many of the teams found local political buy-in was quite important, especially for facilitating and engaging the wider community. And maybe not surprising, it was viewed that considerable time and resources were needed for engagement. This was not only planning for the events, but also delivering them. And finally, teams stated that more guidance would be beneficial on the relationship between design codes and existing policy, and the role of refusing poor quality proposals. Next slide. And so at the end of the program, we had the Planning Advisory Service and their academic partner, UCL, at the mid and final points, interview each of the testing teams for monitoring and evaluation reports. We're still going through this information, but some of the high-level lessons learned by the pilot teams are listed on this slide and the next. And so at the end of the program, the pilot team stated that the design code process essentially sent a very clear message about design quality. So it was beyond looking at just numbers or targets, but it opened up design quality discussions with officers and members, and they found that quite beneficial. They've stated that it takes time, skills, and resources for the process, especially if engagement is required, which it should be at each of the stages. And some places found design coding more challenging and complex. For example, in city center locations, there's fractured ownerships. You've got different landowners and developers wanting to move at different paces, but also having different ambitions for their sites. Also, in lower value areas, there was challenges about viability and in many discussions on raising design quality and trying to understand how best to do so without undermining viability. And so all the teams thought viability was quite essential in the process. And in some cases they were able to, in other cases they aimed to, but didn't achieve it. The early discussions with developers and landowners are quite essential, and that helps to understand what's possible and also gets them on board as part of the process. And teams also often discuss the how design codes could deliver creativity and also give certainty with a baseline of design quality. And so there was discussions about which parameters would be the must-haves and where they might dictate where the baseline of quality might be, but also allowing flexibility with other parameters where they could envision creativity happening with design teams in the future. Next slide. And so the final lessons were about giving status to codes and the importance of having policy hooks and understanding how design codes will be delivered. Many teams, especially because it was only a 6-month testing program, stressed that it's important not to reinvent the wheel, not only because the short time frames, but also taking that lesson to future design code exercises and understanding what evidence you might have for existing places. It might be a context analysis, it might be some engagement, it might be a draft master plan. One other team even stated that it was important to understand policy definitions, let's say in the local plan, and understand what an open space is defined as in the local center, and using those exact definitions and boundaries, as it saves time and it gives an alignment to policy. Obviously, the idea of design codes is aiming to focus on placemaking for places ahead of planning applications being introduced in the planning system. So it's a much more proactive approach to places. And because of this, it's identified that there needs to be clear local leadership on the officer of member levels. And whilst community knowledge is quite important in the process and is valuable, it also has its limits. So the community and different stakeholders can contribute a great understanding to the place, and it's essential that they're brought on the journey. It's also a two-way dialogue where to bring them on the journey, oftentimes there was more time needed for some concepts. For example, if there's a planning application, it's really clear to know what's being proposed. But some of the teams found that with the community engagement, that to bring them along the journey, it was a little more difficult to talk about concepts when there isn't a proposal, when you're talking about maybe building heights or uses, but not in the concrete sense of a proposal. And finally, different approaches are needed at different scales. So if a place is looking at an area-wide design code, yes, having understanding of the context is essential, but it might need to be less detailed than if you're looking at a specific town center, for example. And also different approaches at different scales have different implications on the ground. So it was interesting in the early stages for different places to understand what an area-wide code would deliver as opposed to a site-specific one. Next slide. And so just taking it back from the pilots and back to the audience, what do you feel are the biggest barriers, or what is the biggest barrier to your local area in undertaking design coding? If you can just click on the poll and answer the question, that'd be great to understand what people think they're facing. So far, obviously, lack of capacity within the local authority. lost the poll. So a lot about capacity, lack of design skills within the local authority, the cost of preparing design codes, more so than the other ones. Okay. Next slide, please. And I'll hand it over just to Sarah Allen, Head of Architecture at DLUC, just to briefly give an overview of the design code Pathfinders.
Hello, yes, thank you very much, Scott. This is now looking ahead, moving on to what we had called phase 2 pilots. So we've been going through a large number of expressions of interest, which local authorities and other organisations leading on design codes submitted up to September, and those are all being assessed and sort of decided on. And the focus is for local authorities producing design codes from the county to the district scale, as well as neighbourhood planning areas, which include neighbourhood forums as well as parish councils. And then successful teams will work with their communities, which is really important. The role of design codes to prioritise engagement with communities to help set local design standards, as well as working with us in the Office for Place to develop good practice codes and processes. And we will be sort of monitoring the learning and providing different means of helping people who are selected to engage with this second phase and produce as many good codes and examples of good codes as possible.
Great, thank you, Sarah. I will hand it over to Ashley Baldwin, Head of Planning and Building Control at Nuneaton and Bedworth. Ashley led one of the testing program pilots.
Thank you, Scott. Afternoon all. Next slide, please. So I'm Ashley Baldwin, as Scott said, Head of Planning and Building Control at Borough Council. What I'm going to go through predominantly is our testing process that we went through, and then focus on lessons learned. So there's less about the content of our code, but within the presentation there is links to the code. It's available on our website. Okay, next slide, please. Can we have the next slide, please? Okay, so in terms of the context then, when we became aware of the opportunity to submit for pilot status, there was cross-party support at the authority to make a bid. And that's predominantly driven by the planning committee being very passionate around design and challenging officers to see better design coming in front of them at committee. So we obtained that cross-party agreement. We also had a very strong policy position. So the council has an adopted local plan, recently adopted in 2019, and there's quite a bit of other supporting evidence base regarding specific design documents that we have as supplementary planning documents, as well as concept frameworks that are established across the borough. So we felt we had a good policy position to be working with. The other relevant factor for us as an authority is that we are quite constrained from a land perspective, and I'll talk a bit more about the borough shortly. But in effect, a lot of our land that is greenfield is effectively green belt. So that's a constraint. And then within the urban area, there are challenges on a number of our brownfield sites. And just generally, we're a low value area compared to the wider locality, the wider county. So viability is a real challenge within the borough, and that's been a consistent battle at planning committee for members to address. When we were successful as part of the bidding, we decided to focus on a strategic allocation. and I'll talk a bit more about that. But we felt that this approach would be good for us because the allocation that we tested is strategically important to the authority, and there was no planning application submitted on that application on that allocation. So we thought it'd be a good test for us to see how coding might work. And then finally, from a resource perspective, we are a small authority, so our resources are stretched. We don't have any urban design officers, we don't have any architects, so we were quite upfront that we would need to commission some support, and we commissioned a company called PRP Architects, who we were very happy with, and they did the bulk of the work for us as part of our coding pilot. Next slide, please. In terms of geographical context, the borough sits within Warwickshire, to the north of Warwickshire. We are, I think, the smallest district within the county, but the most densely populated. We're predominantly urban, and like I say, we have quite a bit of green belt surrounding the urban area. The site in question, which you can see on the right hand side of your screen, is referred to as Arbury. That's on the urban fringe, and that was previously Greenbelt, and was allocated through the borough plan process, local plan process. We call it borough plan at the authority. So there's no longer Greenbelt designation on that land, and at the moment it's an extant allocation. Next slide, please. Okay, in terms of the site in a bit more detail, so it was allocated in the local plan for 1,500 dwellings, and then a mix of use classes consisting of residential, schools and community uses, although that's open to additional development uses on the site if it's appropriate. As I mentioned, we've got a wealth of evidence relating to the site, which did help the coding process. So we've got an adopted concept framework which provides some overarching principles that we want to see come forward on the site, which effectively is depicted on the map on your left. There's extensive engagement with the landowner and agent that was required to get the site allocated through the plan process, and that's continued. And obviously our aspiration is that this site does come forward. It's a key part of our future land supply. Okay, next slide, please. So thinking more about the testing process, if we can just move on again, please. Can we bring the next slide up, please? I think there might be a slight delay in the slides progressing forward. There we go. Okay, so in terms of the testing process, when we were awarded pilot status, we established a project team. So I was project manager for Nuneaton and Bedworth Borough Council, and as part of that testing programme, we reported directly into the Department for Levelling Up. We appointed PRP as the consultancy support, and I would say they predominantly drove the project. They did the bulk of the work. We had competing pressures at the authority, so without them, we wouldn't have delivered the code. I can absolutely say that. What we did do, which I think was really useful, was we commissioned our neighbouring authority, Coventry City Council, to act as a critical friend. So we do benefit from abutting a number of metropolitan authorities with larger teams, and Coventry do benefit from having an urban design team, and they contributed to our project, and that was really helpful for us. Part of the wider project team, then, we had elected members who were engaged in the project, other officers, so that was internal at the council, and then also at the county council, because we are a two-tier area, and then we had community leads. So what I would say is that the right-hand side of this flow diagram, that was predominantly the day-to-day project team. We met weekly, if not more regularly, and the work was quite intensive. And then we tended to bring in the wider project team as and when we needed them. Okay, next slide, please. So in terms of the engagement process, like I say, I'm not going to go into the detail of the code itself, but in terms of engagement and formulating the code, that was seen as one of the sort of paramount prerequisite requirements that we needed to do in order to develop the code. So the stage one element was quite intensive, and I will come back to engagement in terms of lessons learned. But that initial stage was very much around scoping. So we did physical events, online events, and we did have to adapt because of changes to COVID requirements, and the authority had some more stringent requirements that we had to meet regarding COVID. So we did have to adapt. But we did manage to hold a walk around for the site and some physical events in the evening. Was a drop-in and Q&A session. And we also did some engagement within primary and secondary schools, which was really effective and something that we'd like to do again. And we also created a bespoke website for the code, which we thought would be a good idea to try to detach it from the council's website, but it wasn't particularly effective. Then we moved to stage two when we were moving towards the submission. And at this point, we had intended to do more consultation with more physical events with the public, but due to time, we decided to keep stage two quite focused and focus more on the statutory consultees in terms of really refining the draft elements of our code. So that, for example, was with, say, ecology experts, highway experts, just really trying to refine that coding. And then the final stage was actually post submission to the Department for Levelling Up, and we asked PRP architects to do some additional work on the code to give us something that we could take forward as potentially developing a supplementary planning document, which is effectively where we are at now. Okay, next slide, please. So the content of the code, I won't dwell on this. If you're going to look at the code, I'd focus on looking at the section which states design coding. So we effectively break down the detail of code into those 4 areas: open space and nature, movement connectivity, built form, character narrative. And within each section, we tried to create a set of requirements that any applicant, as part of what we envisage to be an outline application, would have to address. And they're quite clearly illustrated within the code. And then the other bit to look at is under other matters, and there's a compliance checklist, and that's there to help the case officer and applicant to demonstrate conformity with the code. Okay, next slide, please. So you're focusing on lessons learned, then if we can move on again, please. So in terms of your program, and what I would say is this is very much from our example, a strategic site. And I think the lessons learned would probably be different for each authority, but hopefully these will be useful if you're looking to take forward coding, particularly at the strategic level. So I think being clear about the scope, coverage and structure is paramount, and that seems fairly obvious. But I think we were given grant award pilot status, and it was such an intensive program. We had to establish our scope quite quickly, and in hindsight, I think we did have to adapt quite a bit during that first month. So our initial scoping, our ambitions were more excessive than actually what we achieved, albeit we are very happy with our final product. I think if we did that again, we'd probably spend a bit more time looking at that to see what is realistic and what is it we're looking to achieve. Now, if you're at a master plan, a strategic level, clearly that's going to define to an extent what your code will be looking like. Now, what we found is it was really difficult to get to that finite detail. So ultimately, the code that we have established is quite a high level code, but we've tried to make it unique to the area. And I think that is a real challenge. And I do believe that we've achieved that. And I give a lot of credit to PRP there. Now, we as an authority, this was all new to us. And I would say we had to adapt quite a bit and amend the process quite a bit. So I think being open about that, especially if you've not done it before, will be important. Now, engagement I'll come back to later because I've got a slide focused on that. But what I would say in terms of your program, build in quite a bit of time for engagement, because we needed the engagement to work at every opportunity and it didn't. So while we had some successes, we had some failures, and we didn't really have time to resolve those and go back. It was just too intensive of a program. So yeah, again, we would relook at that, but I'll come back to engagement in a bit more detail. Next slide, please. So resourcing, I mean, this is a common theme whenever I talk to anyone about coding. Now, what I would say is I do believe in the product. I do believe that we have something better for the area than if we didn't have a code. So I think it is worth the effort and expenditure on coding. In terms of any sort of resource assessment, obviously build that into your sort of basic project management. Do an assessment at the outset. What are your skills? Where are your gaps? And what are your risks? So for us, we had a number of competing pressures, which meant that a number of officers who I would have liked to have been involved in the project within the service were actually unable to, because they were otherwise engaged on other priorities at the authority. And I think that's an important element for elected members to be aware of. Coding, even if you're engaged on the periphery, there can be quite a bit of detail there, so it does take time. We commissioned PRP. Even as project manager, the commitment there was quite intensive. So we had weekly meetings, and there was quite a bit to take in. So that needed to be built in. The feedback we had from PRP is that they did some work at costs. So if we were to do the exact same commission again, then it would be more expensive. We would probably do it differently because we've obviously got a bit more experience now as well. And you can get a bit more information on that side of it on our website. Now, stakeholders for us are absolutely fundamental to the process. So being a two-tier, there's a number of professions that we need: public health, highways, education, etc. And then obviously you got your statutory consultees, Environment Agency, etc. They were brilliant. They really helped us. But I think it was incredibly challenging for them to balance our requests along with their day-to-day commitments, and everyone is stretched. So I think I would go back and try agree what is realistic for them to feed into, and if there is a gap, we probably need to be creative, and it might be that we might need to bring some other experts into the process and commission some additional work, some additional consultants to help us if need be. Next slide, please. Okay, so in terms of that engagement, I've mentioned about the statutory consultees. The physical events were somewhat disappointing. We received quite a bit of criticism from the public. Now, there's a few components to that. So we were actually consulting on a number of different other policy documents at the time, one of them being a review of the local plan. Now, the site allocation is very contentious within the area, and I think the message got lost in terms of our comms approach. So I think we need to relook at that, and that's something we've taken back internally. So although we got quite a few numbers at the physical event, the actual feedback wasn't particularly helpful. and clearly that's something we did want to get from the process. But while officers and PRP colleagues try to explain there's an opportunity here to feed into a code, the emphasis really from the public was, look, we just don't want development here. So that wasn't effective. So we need to look at that. What I would say is the school events was brilliant, and that's something I would invest in the future. That was really positive process, just in terms of getting people to engage, but also the feedback we got. The other thing we've talked about is perhaps we should have brought in some engagement specialists, say facilitators, to some of those events. And I think that goes back to your programming in terms of being really clear about what it is you want to achieve. Now, the website we thought would be really good. It didn't work. It was quite expensive. And I think it didn't work in the sense that people didn't know it was there. So I think we just didn't market it and we rushed it. And I think that there is merit in us as a local authority looking at bespoke websites. We have used them as part of our sort of commercial development that we've undertaken, the commercial arm of the authority, and that has worked. So I'm a bit lost why it didn't work, but it didn't seem to work in this instance. Okay, next slide, please. Can we move the slide on, please? Okay, while we're waiting for that slide to come up, it's on outputs. Is there an issue with the slide loading? Can someone tell me?
I think your internet might just be a bit slow, Ashley. The slide's up for us, so if you just crack on as well as you can, and it should be with you in a sec.
Great. Okay, so in terms of outputs, we were predominantly really pleased with what we had produced, and what we are now looking to do is take the code forward as part of a supplementary planning document. So that's available on our website, and that goes live on the 31st of this month. Ultimately, the test will be in the development that comes forward. The key thing really is that the compliance checklist, which is within the code, and if you go and have a look at it, that was the most popular component of the code for officers. So it's always thinking about, from the DM perspective, how will this help case officers? Ultimately, it shouldn't be adding work, it should be making it easier for them. Now, this compliance checklist should be a process which we think will facilitate a quicker determination and a simpler determination for the case officer and the applicant. I won't dwell on any other elements of the outputs. I'm going to pass back over to James. That concludes my slides. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, Ashley. So thanks to Lee, Scott and Ashley for sharing their knowledge and experience. We're just going to move on to our panel Q&A segment now. So remember to pop your questions in the chat and like the ones you want answered too. Lee will come back in a second to facilitate the panel Q&A. Thanks, Lee.
Thank you. I'm just swapping my slides around so it looks like I'm paying attention, because I've got the questions. We've got a lot of questions come in. I've been answering some on the call, but there was I'm going to kick off with a couple that have come in that directly relate to Homes England. One of the questions, and it probably wasn't clear in my presentation, is when I talk about Homes England, our design codes, that is when we have inherited or we have an extant outline consent and there is no design code in place. And so this is our interim approach of using coding as a control mechanism to improve the quality on sites that are live and running. Naturally, moving forward from a Homes England perspective, we wholeheartedly adopt the National Design Guidance and the approach taken in the National Model Design Code. And so our expectation is from day one, all of our sites, when we buy them, and they don't have an outline consent, part of the briefing document for the consultant team is they will need a design code to support the master plan. So that's a given in terms of how Homes England will be moving forward. But the stuff that I talked about today is where we're trying to influence design quality through coding on sites that are already in play, just to clarify that. So one's come up regarding, I'm trying to scroll through them now. I've got a series of WhatsApps and messages coming up. So one of the questions, and I'll throw this to Scott, is when and how can we see the outputs of the National Model Design Code pilots for the different scales of code, especially the county-wide one?
Sure.
Come in on that, please, Scott.
Thanks, Lee. The testing program, just to reiterate, was looking at testing aspects of the process of the National Model Design Code and see how well it worked in different contexts. So we're hoping to get something out from the monitoring and evaluation work, but we're assessing that currently. I guess outputs that specifically relate to design code outputs and processes are specifically for the phase 2 or the urban design Pathfinders. So there'll likely be some interest of what comes out of the pilot phase, but it's the testing program phase, but it's more about how it relates to the National Model Design Code. So I guess we have different sessions like this where Ashley speaks and a few other pilot teams will speak at other sessions that we have. So it'll also depend on what each local authority presents and is willing to share, because some of the planning stages are confidential up to a certain extent. So in due course, there'll be something out, but you might really have to wait for the phase 2 urban design Pathfinders just to understand the area-wide or site-specific actual process.
Brilliant, thank you. There's another question that talks about, there was a query, I made reference to the control that we have, obviously codes with the control element from a planning perspective, but whereas we are using that for both trust and confidence with LPAs, but also control from us from a contractual. And the question was asked with the freehold scenario. Could Lee explain the thinking on maintaining the freehold, as it has raised many issues for developers, particularly around affordable housing? So I can only speak on how we sell our land and how we try to embed quality and control quality. So when we take our sites through our DPP panel to the market, they are sold with the benefit of a leasehold for a short period of time during the build. So during the planning and the construction phase, Homes England retain an interest in the land until the final house is sold, at which point the freehold goes over completely to the end owners and possibly the management company or the stewardship model that's in place. But during the planning and the build stage, we are still the landowner, still the freehold owner of that site, and therefore the contractual requirement of the coding can come into play, because we can, worst case doomsday scenario is that we could pull the contract from the developer if they said that they would secure X on planning, and they secured a quality scheme with a design code that had areas that we insisted on that were incredibly important to us from a quality perspective, and then they started to either dilute that either by maybe, a lot of times there's been experience in the industry where the architect or the consultant team that secure the outline consent and the aspiration and the vision is there outlined, but then the working drawings, the delivery aspect is maybe a different consultant and it's value engineered and it's diluted. They're the scenarios that we would want to keep a check on, and that's where the us maintaining the freehold during the build process allows us to use that design code and the elements that have been signed up, that will be a contractual arrangement that we can keep them on the hook. And so most house builders or SMEs that buy our land, that's one of the attractions to them, because they don't have to buy the land up front. So from our perspective, what we're saying to them is, this is the site, we're very clear what we want of it. The design code will establish what's important to us and establish the design quality. That will form part of the contract. By signing that contract, you don't have to pay for the land up front. Most house builders, what they want is certainty. And so when we take sites to the market with the benefit of an outline consent, with the benefit of a design code or a parcel code in place, and hopefully confidence with the local authority, it should shortcut the time it takes to get planning. And add to that, they pay for the land on the drip. You'd think that we believe that is great opportunity for them to raise their game in terms of quality, and the contractual arrangement works for us, and also builds confidence with the local authority. So that's how it works with Homes England, with the control element. But obviously in other scenarios, coding is more from a planning perspective, and the discussion is obviously with landowners and the applicants in terms of how that's delivered. But what I was trying to demonstrate is how we've got angles where we can secure that quality coming forward. I think the other question that's been asked, and apologies, I've got extracts here, so I don't have the names of the individuals that have asked the questions, is the creation of principles and codes to influence things like frontages and hierarchy. Is there an overall vision for the wider place, even just as a single statement, as unless there's a vision is clear and stated, it may not be delivered? And again, I can talk about the way Homes England do it on the interim, but I think that would be something that's really interesting that the other two speakers could talk on, because I think Scott could answer that in terms of what the aspiration is about the coding approach, and also some of the live sites that we've just heard on. Scott, did you want to give an overview of where we stand on visioning within coding?
Sure. I think it's important to look at the National Model Design Code, the 3 steps of analysis, vision, and code. And obviously each place will have a different understanding of a vision. It might be established as part of an engagement strategy with the local communities. It might be somewhere set in an area action plan. It might be in the local plan. So again, it's about using that process and applying it locally. So that vision process should be part of the design code process, and you'll have to determine how that is. If there isn't a vision, for example, in the one pilot, they use a really wide digital engagement approach to identify what a vision could be for the place. It could be 1 or 2 sentences developed from that. It could be working with members and officers. There could be a whole different range of how you determine that vision, but it should be part of the process. Thank you.
Ashley, is there anything you wanted to add with your experience of the work you've been doing on the pilots?
Yeah, so what we did, so there's 2 things. So the allocation was part of the adopted plan. So there's a policy within the adopted local plan which contains a vision, and then there's a concept framework which we established which also contains a vision. So really the code was there to deliver that. What we then did as part of the stage 1 engagement was try refine that vision for the different elements of the code using the national model. And then within our draft code, there's a narrative around vision, which effectively we seek to embed within the code.
Thank you. I think this is probably more of a statement. It might be a response to one of the questions that was posted in the chat. Practical advice for local planning authorities would be helpful. For example, how to apply wording for conditions which require codes, which can be attached to an outline, getting the requirement for codes into allocated site policy and requiring it prior to an outline. I don't know whether there's examples there. I know in my experience in the private sector, sites which have a code at outline stage do result in a much more, as in pre-outline, so that you can test it, does tend to have a more positive output from a design aspect. And I think that's the aspiration, isn't it, Scott, that we're looking at?
Yeah, and it also relates to the idea of having policy hooks in thinking about design codes early.
Sorry, as you can see, there's a fair few pinging up as I'm trying to
Lee, just while you're looking for that, then.
Yeah.
So within our codes, because it's so high level, the expectation is that through conditions as part of any outline, we would conditions look to have more refined, detailed coding to be prepared by the applicant. So I mean, we're confident we could prepare that condition, but I think that is a good point. Having some guidance in terms of the wording to make that effective, that would be helpful to authorities, certainly. Thank you.
I'm going to jump on. There's a couple here that go back to the leasehold, and I don't want to sort of bog it down too much that we're going off topic. But the Homes England our land sale at the leasehold basis is watertight. There are long stop dates and drop dead dates on the delivery of sites of the expectation that we require people that buy our sites, they have to deliver by. So it's pretty watertight. I don't think we've had one site that, in my understanding, where things have fallen foul, but it gives us both the opportunity to push for more, expect for more, but also, ensure to be able to work with the house builder to make sure that things get delivered. So again, I think we're sort of going a little bit off topic here, but that's more, again, it goes back to this control element. It's quite interesting, actually, and I think that we should always, look back on work that's been done before. They've asked, be interested in hearing how various design code pilots that were done by the ODPM over a decade ago played out, Upton and Lawley, because these will almost be fully complete, and if there are any lessons learned. And I think also, it's quite useful to look back, and I wonder whether there's any work on that with some of the pilots that you've drawn on, and again with the drafting of the National Model Design Code, if there are lessons learned from some of those that's inputted into it.
It would be excellent to look back. As part of leading the testing program, we didn't look at earlier codes, and there may be work being done to look at those, but we were just looking at it in the context of the National Model Design Code, and which was the draft document at the time.
So Ashley, there's a question here. A lot of people are saying that the introduction of design codes could be frustrating, with the planning department as stretched and failing to meet targets. And this is from an applicant's perspective. They're saying, so now our projects have been delayed to wait for them. Moreover, we found out that the planning team are looking to apply design codes to projects we've been working on for a few years. We already have a planning performance requirement, and it's all feeling a bit onerous. Do you feel that the local planning authorities, or in your experience, are they a bit overwhelmed? What's the, do they see the coding as a tool that could work, or is there still sort of trying to find their feet? What is it down to resourcing?
Yeah, I think there's two elements there. So I think from our perspective, we as officers and the elected members feel that coding is of benefit to the authority, and we think it is a tool that will really help us. So we're really pleased that it does exist. Where we don't think it's necessarily perfect, and we know there's critical assessment of coding, but we do think it is a benefit to us. Now, the resource element is the sort of contrary to the challenge there for all authorities, I think. And at the moment we're going through a process of budget setting, and local authorities are very stretched. Officers are under a lot of pressure. So I think this is a challenge that the department are really going to have to look at. If we are going to truly take coding forward, it does need to be resourced, and as creative as we can be at authorities, there are challenges there, and we have it with applicants waiting for applications to be determined. Officers are sort of constantly stretched. So there's a challenge there, but ultimately as an authority we do see it as an opportunity. We would look to work with our neighbours, whether they be receptive to that, but that's ultimately the approach we would take. But we certainly don't have the budget to recreate the exercise we went through. So I do think that is challenging, and we look forward to what might come out nationally on that. I think if something did come out nationally, it'd be really important to ensure that there is something ring fenced, so it doesn't kind of get diluted elsewhere.
Thank you. I've got you. I've got another question, so don't mute yet. So this is specifically in response to your presentation. And Ashley, can you give an example of exactly what your code includes that the National Design Guide doesn't? I.e., is there any sort of quantification that has been locally been determined to be necessary? I think the question here is about the content of county/borough codes that's unique to their area, and it's not straightforward. It's not just a repetition of the National Design Guide. So yeah, it's just, is there any standout element? Have you been able to grasp something that is specific to your area?
Yeah, so what we did, I mean, without pulling exact detail out, I'd advise taking a look at the code. It is quite easy to work through. But when PRP pulled together the respective elements on that contents that I referred to, they engage with experts at the authority. So in terms of open space, we identified specific elements around allotments that are completely specific to the borough. And then there was other elements, say, around play provision. So we went into that level of detail. And if you go through our code, there's some blue boxes. And within those blue boxes is where we've tried to take forward the national model to make it more locally specific, albeit is still at quite a strategic level. And ultimately, we'll have to see how the consultation goes that we're going to run on the supplementary planning document to see what feedback we get. And we'd welcome comments from the audience as well, be that as part of the consultation or separately in terms of critiquing that.
Thank you. And this is I'm not going to say it's not a mischievous question, it's going to be a bit controversial to both of you, and I think the intent and the aspiration for the National Model Design Code is solid, and who doesn't want a more consistent, a more robust and a better quality design through the planning system. I think in the utopian approach, it would be if you could get the code in place at allocation stage or pre-allocation stage, happy days, because it's about certainty, it's about commitment. And to me, some of the questions that have been asked about, how do we deal with land and viability and commerciality in the north and the south? And my simplistic approach, having been on the other side of the table, is if there is clarity of what is expected of that site and there is certainty supported by that expectation, that will establish land values. And if the code is aspirational and ambitious, that should flatten land values as well, because you've not got landowners aspiring and playing one-upmanship trying to get the consent in the allocation. So to me, the ideal solution would be if you could capture it and get it right by allocation stage. But how do you have that conversation at allocation stage? Because at that point, people aren't interested in about what it's going to look like. What they're concerned about is, why is it here? So how do we feel that the National Model Design Code can have that meaningful conversation with people at that early stage?
I mean, I can chip in and probably go to Ashley afterwards. But interestingly, sitting here and watching your presentation, Lee, and Ashley's, design codes typically in the UK were associated with planning applications. So a design code would be the quality control for an agreed master plan. In I guess the parcel codes and also the work that Ashley, you've done in your testing program pilot, it's before that stage. And exactly that, Ashley, you were looking at the allocation stage of how you look at a design code. And it's quite interesting about who you bring on as part of that visioning exercise, including the landowners and stakeholders. So I think it depends. It's specific in every case, because there's always going to be challenges everywhere and at whatever time we look at. So it's just trying to cater to the process, which hopefully the steps in the National Model Design Code are clear enough to follow to cater it locally. But in certain areas, there'll be certain steps that have to be really specifically catered. Other areas, there could be just different processes applied that you just do it at the right stage. So it depends, obviously. But Ashley, it'd be good to hear more about your work and why you chose to do it at the allocation stage, I guess.
I think in terms of the question, I think if you wanted to make a requirement of plan making, I think you'd have to effectively set that out as part of the EIP process. It's not necessarily something that I would advocate. I think that is quite a bit of work for authorities to go through, and I could see EIPs becoming quite convoluted. That's just my opinion. I mean, in terms of our approach, I mean, we have got the site allocated, and we very much prepared this code on the basis of we're expecting an application to come forward, and we want to steer that application. That said, we have got a concept framework already established, which is probably a level above a master plan, and we did ultimately want to get a master plan developed as part of this coding process, but that just wasn't feasible. I think from our point of view, the amount of effort put into this code and the work we've done today, I think we'll leave it now, and we'll look for the developers to take something forward. We'll get the SPD adopted hopefully, and then I think we've got a good framework to be working with. So it's a bit of a complex answer there, I'm afraid.
No, that's well, it's a complex subject, isn't it? There's many moving parts, aren't there, moving forward? I think that's the majority of the questions. I mean, Scott, we talked previously, you had a prompt regarding the sequencing, didn't you, of coding and master planning? I didn't know if you wanted to touch on that to finish.
Yeah, we talked a little bit about that just in the last point with allocated sites and in the visioning. So, it's I think covered to a certain extent, but all I guess want to say towards the end is it's really encouraging to see so many people here, obviously interested in design code. So yeah, I mean, I guess watch the space, and we'll have something out about the pilots in due course, but also we'll be starting the second phase at some point shortly as well.
Brilliant. So unless there are any other pressing questions that are jumping out, I think we'll round up on the Q&A.
Yeah, thanks very much, Lee. So thanks to our speakers, Lee Johnson, Scott Adams and Ashley Baldwin, and to everyone for attending. Thanks very much, everyone.